Welcome to the deep dive. You've sent us your sources, and we're here to extract the essential insights for you.
That's right.
Today, we're venturing into, well, a true cornerstone of psychology, Joseph Breuer and Sigmund Freud's studies on hysteria.
Absolutely foundational. This book isn't just old, it really laid the groundwork for so much.
It really did. It's where so much psychodynamic thinking began, wouldn't you say?
Oh, definitely. This is the wellspring. And it's a scientific work, carefully documented observations, their initial theories.
Trying to make sense of, well, what they called hysteria back then, a really complex set of symptoms.
Exactly. And for you, our listener, maybe wanting to grasp the core ideas without wading through the whole dense text.
That's what we're here for. That's our mission for this deep dive.
We'll unpack the key mechanisms, the observations Breuer and Freud presented in this, well, incredibly important work.
Okay, let's dive in then. Where did they start? What was their initial focus?
Their very first goal was pretty straightforward, actually. They wanted to identify the precipitating cause.
The trigger, basically.
Yeah, that initial event that sort of set everything off for the hysterical symptoms they were seeing.
But it wasn't as simple as just asking patients, so what happened, was it?
Oh, not at all. They hit roadblocks pretty quickly.
Like what?
Well, sometimes patients were just reluctant, hesitant to talk about certain things.
Understandable.
But more often, it seemed they genuinely couldn't remember the initial event. Or if they did remember something, they didn't see any connection to their current symptoms.
So at disconnect, how did they bridge that gap then?
Hypnosis. It became absolutely critical.
Ah, right.
Under hypnosis, patients often access memories from right when their symptoms first appeared.
Which allowed Breuer and Freud to actually demonstrate that link.
Exactly. A
Yeah.
cause and effect relationship that was otherwise hidden.
That's fascinating. And they had this really powerful analogy, didn't they, for how these forgotten traumas kept having an effect.
They did, yeah. The body-foreign analogy.
Explain that a bit.
The idea was that the memory of the trauma, it just kept acting, almost like a splinter. A foreign object lodged inside long after the actual event was over.
Wow. Still causing irritation, basically.
Precisely. And this led to one of their most famous early lines. Hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences.
So it's the memories, the reminiscences that are the problem, the unresolved stuff.
Yeah, like unprocessed files still active in your mental system,
Yeah.
using up resources.
That paints a clear picture. So, okay, a difficult thing happens, gets pushed away, and causes trouble later. But how do most people, normally deal with tough experiences?
Right, that's where they introduced the concept of abreaction.
Abreaction.
It was seen as this initial kind of natural way of dealing with psychic trauma. Basically, an emotional discharge.
Like letting it out, processing it immediately.
Kind of, yeah. Working through the feelings right then and there.
And how does that contrast with what they saw or didn't see in hysteria?
Well, normal processing, unlike that blocked abreaction, involves integrating the memory.
Integrating it how?
It gets woven into the bigger web of associations,
Yeah.
Compared with other experiences, maybe contradictory ones, it gets rectified by other representations, as they put it.
So it gets put in context, filed away properly in the mental library.
That's a good way to think about it. So you can understand it in context. Normal individuals can kind of lessen the emotional intensity through this ongoing association process.
But if that doesn't happen, if the abreaction is denied or it doesn't get integrated.
Exactly. Then those pathological representations, the unprocessed traumatic memories, they persist. They keep their original intensity.
Because they haven't gone through that normal wear and tear.
Precisely. They haven't been fully abreacted or re-experienced within that broader network of associations.
So the memory stays raw, potent.
Okay.
Now, they also started noticing something about the state of mind these memories were kind of locked into, right? Something about consciousness being divided.
Yes, definitely. As they went on, they got more and more convinced there was this fundamental division of consciousness in hysteria.
Like the mind splitting?
Sort of. They even suggested that what was known in really extreme cases as double conscience, almost like two separate selves, was actually present in a more basic form in all hysteria.
So the mind isn't always unified. Traumatic stuff can get sectioned off.
That was the idea, and it led them to coin the term hypnoid states.
Hypnoid states, meaning?
These abnormal states of consciousness that they thought contributed to this division. They noted they agreed with others at the time, like Binet and the Genets, on this point.
Right. So these difficult memories are held in these separate sort of hypnoid pockets of consciousness. Now, Thinking about hysteria, historically, you often picture those dramatic hysterical attacks. Charcot described them in detail. How did Breuer and Freud explain those?
Well, they looked at Charcot's phases, particularly the third one, the attitudes passionnelles.
The hallucinatory phase.
Exactly. Their explanation started right there. They saw that phase as a hallucinatory re-experiencing of a key traumatic memory.
The memory that triggered the whole thing.
Yeah. Whether it was one big trauma, what they called traumatic hysteria, or a series of linked smaller traumas, which they thought was more common.
So the dramatic poses, the expressions during attacks, were like acting out the memory in a dreamlike state.
Essentially, yes. But what's really interesting is they looked at attacks that seemed purely physical, too.
Like spasms or stiffness.
Right. Generalized spasms, even catatonia, and even in those cases, under hypnosis.
They found a memory.
Consistently. A memory of the psychic trauma or traumas was always there underneath.
It really does seem like all roads led back to these hidden memories for them. What about the overall course, the progression of severe hysteria? How did they map that out?
They saw a fairly typical pattern. First, this representative content, the core of the trauma, would form within those hypnoid states.
Okay.
If that content got intense enough, it could trigger a period of acute hysteria.
With physical symptoms and attack.
Yes, somatic symptoms and attacks. Then, eventually, that acute phase would often die down, but leave residues behind.
And then the attacks could just come back.
Exactly. When the normal personality was back in charge, so to speak, the remnants of that hypnoid stuff could reemerge as attacks.
Triggered how? Spontaneously.
Sometimes spontaneously, yeah, like any memory popping up, or through association.
Like touching a sensitive spot, a hysterogenic zone?
Right, or even just a new experience that slightly resembled the original traumatic one.
And either way, the trigger essentially just reactivated that old, overly sensitive memory.
That was the core insight. Both types of triggers tapped into what they called a hyper-aesthetic memory.
This is all quite complex. Now, they famously use detailed case studies to illustrate these ideas. Anna O is probably the most famous one. Tell us about her.
Yes, Anna O, treated by Breuer, was absolutely foundational. Her symptoms started with her eyes crossing convergent strabismus back in December.
Okay.
By mid-December, she was bedridden and stayed that way till April. And she developed this rapid onset of really severe problems. Headaches, the eye problems getting worse with double vision, feeling like the walls were closing in, other visual disturbances, paralysis in her neck muscles, then contractures, anesthesia in her limbs. A whole cascade.
And didn't she have that very strange language issue too?
She did, yes.
Yeah.
In certain states, she could only speak English. Couldn't understand German.
Wow, so people had to speak English to her.
They did, but oddly, she could still read French and Italian, and she'd translate them aloud into English as she read. Fluent translation.
That is bizarre. And her writing changed too.
Yeah, she started writing only with her left hand, using Roman letters she copied from her Shakespeare edition. Very peculiar.
But the really groundbreaking thing about Anna O was the treatment, wasn't it? The talking away of symptoms.
Precisely. That was the huge breakthrough. Her paralyses, anesthesias, vision and hearing issues, neuralgias, coughs, tremors, speech problems. Remarkably, they were resolved when she described the very first time each symptom occurred.
Just by talking about the origin.
Yes. For instance, the strabismus, the double vision, deviating eyes, limited visual field, even seeing a skull instead of her father, her inability to read all gone, one by one, as she recounted the origins and the emotions tied to them.
Amazing. Were there any exceptions?
Yes. Interestingly, some symptoms that started while she was already bedridden, which probably didn't have an immediate psychic cause, those weren't affected by the talking cure.
So it had to be linked to a specific emotional event.
It seems so. Some symptoms were clearly tied to specific emotional moments in her waking life and would reappear predictably.
Like the example with the watch.
Exactly. Her macropsia, seeing things too large, and the strabismus were traced back to looking at a watch tearfully at her father's bedside. She strained to see it through tears, suppressed her distress, and the symptoms appeared.
And how did the treatment end? Was it successful?
Yes. Anna herself set a firm end date 1 year after she went to the countryside. In the final days, they deliberately rearranged her room to mimic her father's sick room.
To trigger the core memory.
Yes, and she powerfully re-experienced the terrifying hallucination believed to be at the root of it all. The original time, she could only pray in English. Immediately after this re-experiencing, she could speak German again, and many remaining issues vanished. She made a full recovery afterward.
Incredible story. And Breuer used the echinoderm eggs analogy to explain its importance, right?
He did. He compared her case to studying sea urchin eggs in embryology.
Why sea urchins?
Not because they're special in themselves, but because their transparent protoplasm allowed really clear observation of basic biological processes. Anna O's case, he felt, was similar.
Its clarity illuminated the process.
Exactly. The exceptionally clear, understandable development of her illness offered crucial insights into how hysteria worked, even if her specific symptoms weren't typical. It was the clarity of the pathogenesis.
A perfect window into the mechanism. So Anna O was compelling evidence. Now, they discussed other cases too, like Mrs. Emmy von N, treated by Freud. What stands out there?
Freud started with Mrs. Emmy von N in May 1889 using Breuer's hypnotic investigation technique.
Okay.
He admitted he wasn't fully skilled with it yet, so he kept very detailed daily notes. She also had periods of delirium.
And what's particularly noteworthy about her case?
Well, we see a shift in Freud's approach during her treatment.
Shift how?
He began moving away from digging for the origin of every single symptom. Instead, he started using hypnosis more to give suggestions, aimed at preventing relapses when she went home.
Ah, using suggestion therapeutically. Was he influenced by others there?
Yes, very much by Bernheim's work on suggestion.
And did this new approach work for her?
She improved rapidly, actually, said she felt better than she had since her husband died. The initial treatment was about 7 weeks.
And were there lasting effects?
Interestingly, yes. The discoveries made under hypnosis about her eating and drinking difficulties had an immediate and lasting positive impact. She started eating well, gained weight.
But Freud did follow up later.
He did the next spring. Her daughter had some issues, and there was a family history of, well, what they called neuropathic heredity. But Mrs. Emmy herself was still doing well, mostly.
And Freud reflected on the diagnosis itself.
He did. He talked about the difficulty of diagnosing hysteria cleanly, especially with what they saw as mixed neuroses. But he pointed to things in her case suggesting hysteria: mild delusions, altered personality and somnambulism, anesthesia in her leg, her history, ovarian neuralgia.
And her case reinforced the idea of converting emotional energy.
Absolutely. They reiterated that idea: hysterical symptoms as the result of trapped traumatic excitations, not discharged through abreaction or thought. Freud specifically introduced the concept of quantities of excitation being transformed into somatic symptoms.
So sometimes it's less about direct symbolism and more about this pent-up energy finding any physical outlet.
That seems to be the idea he was developing, yes, an important distinction.
Okay. Now, thinking about those physical symptoms, they stressed that not all pain, for instance, had the same root cause.
Right. Pain was a key example. Some could be organic, like rheumatic pain.
But other pain.
Could function as a memory, a mnemonic symbol. Pain linked to emotionally charged times, like caring for the sick, becoming a physical representation of that past emotional state.
A symbol in the body. And they looked at other physical things, too, like act tics or speech problems.
They did. They analyzed a tic described as convulsive sounds and traced it to a conflict between intention and a counterwill, an internal struggle.
And the jerky nature reflected that conflict.
Exactly. And similarly, stuttering, or spastic inhibition of speech, was seen as a residue of a similar cause, the attempt to inhibit speech becoming a symbol of the event.
And these could become chronic.
Yes, what's interesting is how these motor symptoms, first linked to a specific trauma, could become chronic through repetition. And then they could get linked to any fear or anxiety.
Leading to monosymptomatic hysteria.
Right, where one symptom becomes the main focus point for ongoing anxiety.
So a symptom could take on a life of its own. What about Mrs. Emmy's altered states, delirium, and somnambulism? Did they analyze those deeply?
Well, the delirium wasn't fully analyzed, partly because she got better relatively quickly.
But the somnambulism, induced by hypnosis.
That offered more insights. Remarkably, in that state, she seemed to access memories from all 3 states: waiting, delirium, and somnambulism itself.
So she was kind of most integrated in that state.
In a way, yes. She seemed most normal then. Less reserved, more suggestible, but still showing normal mental limits. It wasn't perfect recall.
Not superhuman memory, then.
No, not at all. Even then, her knowledge wasn't complete. There was a real and a potential consciousness. She'd often frown, say, I don't know, need prompting.
As she could still resist.
Oh, yes. While she tried to be truthful, she might give incomplete answers. And if she disliked a topic, she could still clam up, even in somnambulism. But overall, the impression was of uninhibited mental power and good memory access within that state.
Now, around this time, Freud started having some doubts about hypnosis and suggestion, didn't he? Questioning Bernheim.
He did. While studying Mrs. Emmy's struggles with volition, her aboulias, he began to seriously question Bernheim's idea that everything is in suggestion, and Delboeff's related idea that hypnotism wasn't really a distinct state.
What was his issue?
He couldn't quite wrap his head around how just saying sleep could create this unique psychic state with access to all psychic experiences. He felt suggestion might evoke this state, but couldn't create its inherent qualities.
This skepticism seems key to his later work, like with Miss Lucy R., where he analyzed without deep hypnosis.
Exactly. Miss Lucy R. didn't enter somnambulism. Her analysis happened in a state Freud thought was very close to normal waking consciousness.
And he admitted his own limits with hypnosis.
Yes, he reflected that he wasn't as successful as Bernheim claimed to be. Couldn't always induce somnambulism, especially after the first few tries.
So if he couldn't reliably use deep hypnosis, how did he access those crucial hidden memories?
He leaned on another of Bernheim's findings that memories from somnambulism aren't truly forgotten, just seemingly so. They could be revived with gentle suggestion and hand pressure, even without deep hypnosis.
Ah, the hand pressure technique.
Right, that became his method. He found it more laborious than working in somnambulism, but it freed the analysis from needing deep hypnosis, and it gave insights into why memories were forgotten, often intentionally pushed away, though maybe not fully consciously.
And it revealed memory's surprising precision.
Yes, seemingly trivial details, numbers, dates, could be recalled with unexpected accuracy using this method.
Now, with Miss Lucy R., they also started asking why conversion happens, right? Why that specific physical symptom.
Yes, Freud wasn't satisfied just linking emotion and symptom. Why hysteria specifically? Why a physical symbol instead of recalling the emotional scene? This was pressing because her hysteria seemed triggered by a recent trauma.
And the idea of auxiliary moments became important here.
Precisely. The initial trauma didn't cause an immediate reaction in her case. Her symptoms started later, at these auxiliary moments.
What defined an auxiliary moment?
It was like a temporary meeting of the conscious and unconscious parts of the mind. A convergence, similar to the state in somnambulism.
And how did these moments trigger the conversion?
In her case, the first auxiliary moment was a scene that reactivated the earlier trauma, showing she hadn't resolved her feelings about her employer. The second moment repeated the pattern.
And interestingly, the second symptom hid the first.
Yes. The first only became clear after the second was analyzed. This led to an important observation about analysis itself,
Which was?
that later symptoms often mask earlier ones. The last symptom analyzed often holds the key to the whole picture.
Fascinating. Layers upon layers. Let's turn to Miss Katharina and her anxiety attacks. What did her case illuminate?
Miss Katharina had these sudden, intense anxiety attacks. Physical symptoms like pressure on the eyes, heavy head, buzzing, dizziness, chest crushing, throat tightness, pounding head.
And intense fear.
Yes, and she saw a frightening face during them, but couldn't recognize it or know where the attacks came from. They'd started about 2 years earlier.
And they tried to connect these back to earlier forgotten events, linking it to that idea of a hypnoid state caused by affect.
Exactly. They linked her feeling of having forgotten everything due to fear to the idea that the intense emotion created a state that isolated the memory from conscious processing. Freud even speculated if the face was linked to a specific past observation involving someone named Franziska.
And they used that analogy of hysteria as pictographic writing.
Yes, like symbols needing deciphering, suggesting being ill could symbolically mean repulsion.
And did they find an event matching repulsion?
Well, her first hysterical symptom had been vomiting, 3 days after feeling repulsion looking into a room. This suggested she might have seen something upsetting there.
So the vomiting was the first symbolic reaction.
Possibly. Interestingly, that symptom had passed, but the anxiety attacks remained, and even gained new content, suggesting some partial abreaction had happened. She had told her aunt about her discovery back then.
And later disclosed other things.
Yes, other unwanted advances, which they kept in reserve.
So even without full recall from Katharina, Freud felt the connections were probable.
He did, acknowledging it was partly conjecture without hypnosis. He framed her erotic experiences as traumatic moments, and the discovery scene as an auxiliary moment.
Similar mechanism, but different reason for the memory being isolated.
Right. Not conscious repression, he thought, but the ego's immaturity, its inability to process sexual experiences then. He saw her case as typical of how pre-sexual impressions gain traumatic power later when understanding develops.
A common developmental pathway for these issues, potentially. Okay, let's move to Miss Elizabeth von R. Pain and defense mechanisms seem central to her case.
Yes. Freud noted her facial expression didn't match the pain from pinching her skin. It seemed more aligned with hidden thoughts awakened by stimulating associated body parts. He'd seen this mismatch before in Hysteria.
And her family situation was a backdrop.
Very much so. Her father's death, social isolation, her mother's poor health. It created this intense focus on family, particularly her mother.
And the search for the cause of her pain led where?
Back to a relationship, likely with her brother-in-law, and a specific scene. The conflict arose from the clash between her joyful feelings then and her father's worsening condition when she returned home. An incompatibility.
Leading to repression and conversion?
Exactly. The erotic feelings were repressed, and the attached affect, the emotional energy, intensified or revived a physical pain present around the same time. A classic example of conversion as a defense.
And her pain pattern changed over time.
Yes, initially lying down helped, but after a stressful train journey related to her sister's illness, lying down became more painful than standing or walking for a long time.
And the treatment wasn't smooth sailing.
No. In the third phase, she felt better mentally, but the pains persisted. Freud knew the analysis was incomplete. He had suspicions, especially seeing her resistance around certain topics.
And then a chance event helped.
Yes, hearing her brother-in-law nearby caused immediate acute pain and made her want to stop the session. This confirmed Freud's suspicion and pushed him towards the decisive explanation.
Which involved confronting her feelings for the brother-in-law.
Precisely, providing an opportunity for abreaction, releasing the pent-up emotion. They explored the history, the early, perhaps unconscious signs of affection.
Like his mistaken greeting, the fiancé's comment, her defending him.
Right. It became clear these feelings were latent for a long time, masked as acceptable fraternal affection.
And the physical pains, when did they likely start? Not with the initial feelings.
Probably not. More likely later when she recalled those impressions. Conversion happened with the memories, not the original experiences themselves. They saw this pattern as common in hysteria.
And even new symptoms could arise this way.
Yes, like her thigh pain after a conversation about him. She insisted it was new. They concluded the conversation triggered older, related memories, creating a new mnemonic symbol, the pain representing the whole group, fueled by renewed effect.
It's like the past constantly echoing in the present through these physical symbols. Now, facial neuralgia and symbolization were also key in her case.
Yes. Freud revisited her facial neuralgia. He evoked an upsetting scene with her husband, and as she described feeling a rough insult, she suddenly cried out in pain, hand to her face, exclaiming, "It was like a slap in the face." And the pain stopped immediately.
Wow. A literal embodiment of the phrase.
A very clear symbolization. But why trigeminal neuralgia specifically? Why that distribution? Why worse with chewing but not speaking? Those questions remained.
Did the neuralgia keep recurring?
It did, the next day. But narrating another perceived insult dissipated it again. This went on for days, suggesting years of insults were fueling these attacks via symbolization.
And her first neuralgia episode, years earlier, was that symbolization too?
Apparently not. That seemed to be conversion through simultaneity, a painful image plus self-reproach, leading to conflict and defense. A pre-existing mild toothache might have facilitated it then.
And they linked her tendency to symbolize to her artistic nature.
They did, suggesting her sense of form played a role. But they also argued it wasn't entirely voluntary. Taking expressions like slapped in the face literally might be reviving the original sensations behind the words.
Like tapping into the physical roots of language?
Possibly.
Mm-hmm.
They connected to Darwin on emotions. Actions originally had purpose. Maybe hysteria restores the original intensity to actions whose verbal expressions now seem merely figurative.
So maybe hysteria and language both draw from a common source of embodied experience.
That was the intriguing possibility they raised.
Profound stuff. Okay, after these deep dives into cases, they shifted to the broader psychical mechanism behind it all. How did they synthesize their ideas?
Well, they acknowledged ideas overlap in a fast-moving field. Hard to pin down who said what first.
Sure.
But they argued that even if only some hysterical phenomena are ideogenic springing from ideas, those are the uniquely hysterical ones. Investigating their psychic origin was the big recent advance.
The key question being how? The mechanism.
Exactly. And they needed different answers depending on the type of symptom, referring back to Mobius's distinction.
Which was?
First, phenomena matching the idea, like hearing voices matching your fears. Relatively understandable like dreams, based on abnormal excitability.
Okay. And the second type?
Phenomena where the problem isn't the content of the idea, but its pathological occurrence like paralysis. They link this to how the idea of impossibility can prevent voluntary movement, like in suggested paralysis.
This brings us back to excitability as a core concept. How did they elaborate on that?
They use that electrical system analogy, optimal tension versus overload causing damage.
Right.
And they distinguished incitement, useful, raising energy uniformly, from excitement, harmful, uneven increase, inhibiting functions, seeking potentially pathological discharge.
And excitement was the basis for the symptom.
Yes, the psychophysical basis. They mentioned physical causes to fatigue, hunger, poisons, drug withdrawal.
And how did they link this general excitability to specific psychic states like sexual feelings or emotions?
They saw sexual excitation and effect as a bridge between those basic endogenous energy increases and full psychic effects. Puberty, for instance. A vague rise in excitation that then gets linked to the idea of the opposite sex or a specific person.
Becoming an effective idea.
Exactly. An idea charged with that emotional energy.
But what happens if that energy, that effect, gets blocked? Can't find an outlet.
That leads to a powerful buildup of intracerebral excitation, mental energy not used in thought or action. In healthy people, it gradually dissipates.
But in other...
Abnormal reactions can appear, an abnormal expression of effects.
Which brings us right back to hysterical conversion, transforming that psychic energy into physical symptoms.
Precisely. They saw the nervous system as interconnected, but with varying resistances. Normally, thought doesn't spill into perception, no hallucinations, vital organs are shielded.
But these resistances vary between people.
Significantly, leading to different levels of effective excitability, from totally unnervous to someone with palpitations at the slightest thing.
And conversion itself is what? A rerouting of that excitation.
They proposed that excitation meant for a thought could get diverted down a peripheral nerve path instead, becoming a symptom.
And the reverse, a blocked reflex causing buildup.
Yes, like a failed sneeze causing tension. They saw a failed psychic reflex, like suppressed revenge, acting similarly. Goethe needing art to discharge feelings was his reflex.
So conversion is like a misdirected psychic reflex, often linked to specific associations, like Anna O's arm or eyes.
Exactly, but they warned against mistaking the superficial trigger for the real cause, like the girl scared by the cat, whose real trauma was a recent assault.
Always look deeper. Now, they also circled back to hypnoid states facilitating this conversion mechanism.
They did. They listed true self-hypnosis as hypnoid states spontaneous, unlike artificial hypnosis. Common in developed hysterias, often alternating with waking life, sometimes called delirium hystericum.
Characterized by amnesia afterwards.
Yes, more or less total amnesia in waking life for what happened in this state, though recallable under artificial hypnosis. This meant ideas formed there weren't corrected by waking thought.
And the lack of criticism allowed weird ideas.
Bizarre delusions, symbolic links based on flimsy associations, even autosuggestions like paralysis following an attack.
But they didn't often trace symptoms directly back to originating this way in their analyses.
Surprisingly, no.
Yeah.
They mostly saw it as the same process conversion of effective excitation happening within or outside these states.
So hypnoid states were significant, but maybe not the ultimate origin point for most symptoms. What about less intense states like absence of mind? Were those pathogenic?
They distinguish between non-pathogenic absence of mind, like during intense work, and pathogenic states like emotionally charged daydreams or fatigue from prolonged distress rumination, anxiety watching the sick, lovers daydream.
How did those become pathogenic?
Intense focus on an emotional thought slows other thoughts, creating absence of mind. But the emotional thought and its effect stay active, with lots of unused excitation. They saw a clear parallel to hypnosis.
How so?
The hypnotized person's thoughts are inhibited, right? Not necessarily asleep, but focused. All the excitation flows to this suggested idea. Affect-laden daydreams work similarly, concentrating energy pathologically.
So intense, narrow emotional focus could be a bridge to these altered states. And they preferred the term hypnoid states over hypnosis.
Yes, because these states were hard to clearly define, but seemed crucial in hysteria's development. They wondered if daydreams or prolonged anxiety could have the same effect as full self-hypnosis.
They were more certain about fear, though.
Yes, intense fear inhibits thought while the idea of danger is hyperactive, just like an affect-laden daydream. The recurring memory keeps the state going, creating hypnoid fear, promoting conversion, the incubation stage of traumatic hysteria.
This keeps pointing towards unconscious ideas and that division of the mind. How did they solidify that concept?
They stressed that unconscious representations weren't isolated fragments. They acknowledged others' work showing large, complex, unconscious mental processes coexisting with conscious life, a crucial division.
And gave that example of vomiting after an upsetting meal.
Right. Seems purely physical, but stops when the original affect is revived under hypnosis. The memory was likely evoked when trying to eat, but didn't enter consciousness clearly because it lacked effect, while the vomiting grabbed attention.
So ideas could be unconscious despite their intensity, because they were inadmissible to consciousness.
Exactly. That was the pathological element. Normally, intense ideas become conscious. In hysteria, admissible ideas coexist with an inadmissible set. The mind's activity isn't fully aligned with potential consciousness.
Not a division of consciousness, but a division of the mind.
That was their key conclusion. And these subconscious ideas weren't corrected by conscious thought, often relating to things that had lost significance consciously.
But still happening in the same brain.
Yes, same brain, likely same cortex, though the how was unknown. They accepted the division as a fact in hysteria.
And hysterical attacks themselves showed this division.
Clearly, conscious thought might fade, then return, with patients aware of their own crazy actions, feeling detached, even guilty of faking.
Conscious self-observing, the unconscious taking over.
Precisely. The division made manifest.
But were all these pathogenic ideas deeply unconscious? Or was it a spectrum?
More of a spectrum, an almost uninterrupted scale from fully conscious ideas triggering odd reflexes to those never conscious except under hypnosis.
But the division itself was key to a psychological theory.
They thought so, especially in severe hysteria, though they doubted they fully understood its origins, especially in acute hysteria cases, suggesting other irrational types of division might exist. Their understanding was still evolving.
Okay. And how do they link this divided psyche to suggestibility, often associated with hysteria?
They proposed the mental weakness from this division was the basis for heightened suggestibility in some patients. Not all. Some had sound judgment.
Defining suggestibility as?
A reduced ability to criticize ideas, whether internal or external. Criticism needs association with opposing stored ideas. Resistance depends on that store and the clarity of new versus recalled ideas.
And this varies normally too.
Yes, related to intellectual temperament. And in pathology, suggestibility increases with poverty of associations like in sleep, hypnosis, reduced mental energy.
So the expelled unconscious part is particularly suggestible.
Due to its limited content, yes. And even the conscious mind's suggestibility might stem from this split innate excitability plus reduced associative power, since energy is tied up in the unconscious, lowers resistance to suggestions.
Though hallucinatory suggestibility needed more.
Yes, an abnormal excitability in perception itself, not just the division.
So the division creates vulnerability, but there's usually a pre-existing sensitivity. They then tackled the specific idiosyncrasy, what makes some excitable people develop hysteria.
Right. They needed more than just abnormal excitability. They refined it. Maybe the abnormality is excitation flowing too easily from the central nervous system to sensory nerves, usually needing external stimuli, and vegetative organ nerves, usually well isolated.
This constant surplus of excitation with easier access explains
Certain phenomena, like focused attention causing excessive local pain, hyperalgesia. Any pain becomes maximal, unbearable.
and the excitation lingers.
Yes, unlike normal fading, it stays and gets amplified, leading to chronic issues from minor damage arthralgia, ovarian neuralgia, and easier triggering of palpitations, fainting, blushing due to accessible circulatory nerves.
So it's both easier central influence and excessive reaction to normal stimuli.
Exactly. Palpitations from mild exertion, not just psychic causes. Slight bronchitis, leading to nervous asthma. It's a general abnormal excitability, with the central axis being key for hysteria.
And they even gave a nod to the old reflex theories.
Cautiously, yes, a conservative heresy. Maybe some symptoms are distant reflexes from other bodily issues, not purely psychic. Vomiting in pregnancy from uterine stimuli, maybe leg weakness from a genital issue via reflex, not conversion.
Important not to overstate their new discoveries.
Yes, warning against applying them exclusively to all cases.
Okay. What about puberty? Often a trigger point. Did they think puberty itself could create the predisposition?
They considered it. Puberty involves more than just increased excitation. Sexual maturation affects the whole nervous system, increasing excitability, reducing resistances everywhere, even in non-hysterical teens.
So puberty could establish the predisposition.
To the extent that the predisposition is this characteristic state of the nervous system, yes. This reinforced their view of sexuality's major role.
And they directly address the interplay of sexual factors and other emotions.
Yes, while noting later distinctions, like insufficient satisfaction leading to anxiety neurosis, not hysteria per se, they saw that even then, sexual affect excitation often converted into hysterical symptoms.
And compared to other effects.
Non-sexual effects, fright, anxiety, anger, could cause hysteria, but the sexual factor was seen as by far the most important, most productive of pathology. They felt the old term hysteria from uterus was closer to the truth than newer ideas downplaying sexuality.
Not necessarily stronger sexual needs, though.
No, needs varied. Patients often got ill because of their struggle against sexuality, their defense against it. But alongside sexual hysteria, they kept the idea of traumatic hysteria from fright.
So a complex mix. Predisposition, processing failures, and specific experiences, especially sexual ones. They also revisited conversion, suggestion, and hypnoid states as components of this predisposition.
Right. They saw phenomena from conversion and suggestion, often autosuggestion, as forming an identical layer. Suggestibility wasn't essential to hysteria, but a complication enabled by the same nervous system idiosyncrasy.
And suggestion often worked on effective ideas.
Yes, usually realizing ideas charged with fear or anxiety, so it often looked like conversion of that affect anyway. These two processes, conversion and suggestion, were seen as the fundamental pathways for psychically determined symptoms.
And the third component, hypnoid states.
Yes, the tendency to self-hypnosis, present in some cases. This state maximally favored both conversion and suggestion, building great hysteria on top of lesser forms.
A temporary state, initially.
Often alternating with normal waking, it involved increased mind-body influence, like hypnosis, but maybe more intense on an already excitable system.
Was this tendency innate?
Unknown. They thought it could develop from affect-laden daydreams, but innate factors likely played a role too. This again highlighted sexuality's influence. Passionate desires fuel such daydreams, and the orgasm itself seemed related to hypnoid states.
Okay, after all that theory, they turned to psychotherapy, specifically Freud's developing views. What was the core therapeutic principle?
He recalled their key discovery from the preliminary communication. Symptoms vanished when the provoking memory was clearly recalled, the affect reawakened, and the event verbalized in detail, the cathartic method.
But Freud's views evolved, and he hit challenges applying it.
Yes. While sticking to the core principle, his interpretations changed. He emphasized these were now his perspectives. Two main difficulties arose.
Which were?
One, not everyone with hysterical symptoms could be hypnotized, despite likely having the same mechanism. Two, needing a clearer definition of hysteria itself, distinguishing it from other neuroses. This led him to reassess their cases.
And what did that reevaluation suggest to him?
He questioned if hysteria was truly independent. Anna O., though seemingly pure hysteria, wasn't analyzed by Breuer regarding sexual neurosis.
And Mrs. Emmy von N.
Freud admitted his initial Charcot-influenced view shied away from sexuality. Rereading notes, he now saw her as severe anxiety neurosis from sexual abstinence, mixed with hysteria.
Miss Lucy R.
Perhaps borderline pure hysteria, brief, episodic, with a clear sexual etiology closer to anxiety neurosis. Anxiety neurosis possibly missed.
Katharina.
A model of virginal anxiety. Anxiety neurosis creating symptoms, hysteria repeating and using them. Typical of many young people then labeled hysterical.
And Miss Elizabeth von R.
Not investigated as sexual neurosis. Freud only suspected an underlying spinal neurasthenia.
So Freud was seeing more overlap, more centrality of sexual factors, but he still valued the cathartic method.
Oh, absolutely. He stressed its proven power, even in acute hysteria, to limit new symptoms, citing Anna O.'s case as proof.
And for chronic cases, where symptoms were persistent but less intense.
There, the lack of a truly causal cure made the cathartic method invaluable as a symptomatic therapy. The goal was reinforcing the patient's resistance.
Because existing symptoms lowered resistance.
Yes, predisposing to more hysteria. New symptoms often formed by analogy to existing ones. A symptom site became a weak point. An expelled psychic group acted like a crystal nucleus.
So removing symptoms via catharsis restored resistance.
That was the idea. Enabling the patient to withstand the underlying cause better. Prolonged supervision, occasional chimney sweeping could help significantly.
But the hypnosis problem remained. Many weren't hypnotizable.
A major obstacle.
Right.
Hypnosis was thought necessary to access pathogenic memories outside waking consciousness. The choice was give up or find another way.
Did Freud figure out why some weren't hypnotizable?
No, he admitted he couldn't explain it. He also noted some actively refused hypnosis. He wondered if both represented a psychic unwillingness, conscious or not, but remained uncertain.
Which pushed him towards techniques beyond deep hypnosis.
Exactly. He realized the crucial thing wasn't deep hypnosis per se, but bringing the memory and its effect to waking consciousness and having the patient verbalize it.
Focusing on overcoming resistance.
Yes. He described his hand pressure technique, assuring the patient something would come, urging them to say it, even if unpleasant.
And this worked. Material emerged.
Often, yes. Sometimes as single keywords needing elaboration, seemingly incoherent fragments, but when explored, they always proved tightly linked, leading to the pathogenic core. He recalled a case where this was severely tested, but ultimately justified.
And the doctor-patient relationship was crucial.
Indispensable, often. The physician's personal influence, the effective bond, was sometimes the only thing strong enough to overcome resistance. Not unique to psychotherapy, he noted, patient cooperation is key in all medicine.
Did he consider just forcing hypnosis more or restricting the method to only the easily hypnotizable?
He acknowledged the temptation, but restricting it meant too few patients. And he was skeptical that forced hypnosis truly bypassed resistance based on limited experience.
His experience suggested hypnosis didn't necessarily make catharsis easier.
Right. He cited the leg paralysis case, deep hypnosis, yet immense resistance. The psychic state, recallability, relationship with him, remained key, not the physical hypnotic signs.
Contrasting with Mrs. Emmy von N.,
where resistance seemed minimal in deep somnambulism. But, he noted, nothing truly difficult emerged then, stuff she could have set awake. The real causes weren't reached in that first attempt, and even she showed resistance on erotic topics or other requests, even in somnambulism.
So he became quite skeptical of hypnosis's power to facilitate catharsis.
Entirely skeptical, yes. Having seen absolute therapeutic recalcitrance in deep somnambulism despite obedience otherwise, it fit the idea of cause and effect applying psychically too.
This led them back to differentiating types of hysteria, like hypnoid versus defense hysteria.
Yes. Hypnoid hysteria, like Anna O, was their first model. Breuer proposed a different mechanism, an idea received in a special state, remaining outside the ego from the start. No force needed to keep it out, so no resistance when accessing it in somnambulism. Anna O showed no such resistance.
And Freud initially agreed this distinction was important.
He did. But strangely, in his own later experience, he never found a pure hypnoid case. All his cases transformed into defense hysterias. Even symptoms emerging in dissociated states, he found, owed their separation to a prior defense mechanism splitting off a psychic group. He suspected the roots converged, with defense being primary, but couldn't say more then.
So defense became the more central mechanism for Freud. Now, what about the organization of all this pathogenic material once uncovered? How did it seem structured?
Their most powerful impression was that this apparently forgotten material, unavailable to the ego, was somehow at hand, correctly ordered. The task was just removing resistance. The connections existed, stored in memory.
Like an unconscious intelligence.
Almost. It seemed possessed by an intelligence not inferior to the ego, misleadingly appearing like a second personality sometimes.
And the structure itself, multidimensional.
Yes, stratified in at least three ways. First, a nucleus, the core traumatic memories or ideas.
Okay.
Second, surrounding that, vast amounts of other material arranged in a triple order. The first of that order, linear chronology within themes.
Like Anna O's deafness having 7 themes, each with chronologically ordered memories.
Exactly. Like perfect archives, a general feature, always emerging chronologically. But this complicated analysis, as recall, reversed the order, recent first, original last.
And the second surrounding order.
Concentric stratification around the nucleus. Layers of equal resistance, increasing toward the core. Zones of similar consciousness modification. Peripheral layers easy to recall, deeper ones harder. Near the nucleus, patients disown memories even while reproducing them. This gave analyses their characteristic course.
And the third order.
Arrangement by thought content. A logical thread, winding irregularly, different for each case, connecting to the nucleus. Dynamic, unlike the other two morphological structures.
Like the knight's move in chess.
Yes, zigzagging back and forth between layers, but generally advancing inwards. And it wasn't just one line.
But branching and converging.
Exactly. Nodal points where threads joined. Multiple threads converging on the nucleus. Symptoms were often overdetermined by multiple factors.
And there could even be multiple nuclei.
Yes, like analyzing a second outbreak linked to a first, adding layers and thought lines connecting the two nuclei.
An incredibly intricate mental map. They use that narrow pass analogy for accessing it.
Yes. How could such a complex camel get through consciousness's eye of a needle? because only one memory enters ego consciousness at a time. The patient sees only that one, forgets others.
And if resistance blocks that one,
The past gets blocked, work stops. The isolated memory stays until absorbed. The material is forced through this narrow slit, emerging in pieces. The therapist's job? Reassemble it, like a Chinese puzzle.
and guessing connections could help towards the end.
Yes. A correct guess speeds things up. A wrong one still helps by forcing the patient to react, betraying their unconscious knowledge.
And they trusted the process, couldn't impose ideas.
They were amazed by that, couldn't influence recall or connections without contradictions arising. Correct predictions were always corroborated by later, undeniable reminiscences. No harm in suggesting the next association.
Finally, what about the deepest representations, the ones hardest to recognize as memories? What did that say about unconsciousness?
Even when logically convinced, patients often said, I accept I thought that, but I can't remember thinking it. Easy to call it unconscious.
But psychologically, what did that mean? Were they never fully thoughts, just possibilities realized in therapy?
They couldn't say definitively without a better understanding of consciousness itself. But the key fact was,
Yes.
they could follow thought chains from conscious to unconscious, not recognized as memory, back to conscious, then unconscious again, without the chain itself breaking logic or connection. You couldn't tell just by looking at the whole chain which parts would be owned as memory. It was like seeing only peaks dipping into the unconscious.
A complex view. And they included an appendix on dating inconsistencies in Mrs. Emmy's case.
Yes, highlighting the challenges of precise historical documentation in these early, intricate explorations.
This has been truly fascinating. A deep dive into studies on hysteria, exploring trauma's effects, abreaction, altered states, the case studies, conversion, the divided mind, and early psychotherapy.
Foundational concepts, really.
For you, our listener, seeking those aha moments, I hope this offered some surprising insights. This work really laid the groundwork for understanding the mind-body connection, memory, trauma.
And the whole trajectory of psychoanalytic thought.
It really makes you think. If these ideas about the unconscious and past experiences had been grasped earlier, how might things have evolved differently? What other narrow passes might still exist in how we understand the mind today?
A lot to ponder.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
The Virtual Books publishing team thanks for your visit. If you liked our channel, please subscribe and share.